They say the wild follows no rules but its own, but when the blizzard screamed across the valley, it brought a creature that didn't just want warmth, it wanted a witness. Most predators hunt in silence, but this one arrived at Mr. Elliot's door carrying a rhythmic code of sounds that no wild animal should ever know, leaving even the resident cat shocked by the words spoken in the shadows. The winter of 2025 arrived not as a season, but as a predator. The weather was colder than usual, and the wind crept through every gap in the doors of the old house, whistling softly like a lonely spirit searching for warmth inside. Inside, the fireplace in the living room had been lit since the early morning, with flames dancing behind the iron grate in a desperate attempt to push back the frost. Yet, the chill lingered in the bones of everything it touched, a persistent reminder of the world outside. Mr. Elliot sat by the kitchen table, his weathered hands, the hands of a man who had spent 40 years mending broken wings and stitching torn paws, wrapped around the handle of a faded ceramic mug with a cat painted on its side. Steam rose from the black coffee inside, curling upward like tiny ghosts before dissolving into the cold air. No one needs an old veterinarian like me anymore. Do they? He whispered to Maisie, the cream-colored cat curled up on the chair beside him. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic, as if he were confessing a shameful secret to the only friend he had left. Maisie only flicked her ears slightly, a barely noticeable movement that could have meant anything or nothing at all, as her eyes remained closed in the gentle rhythm of sleep. She was content, unbothered by the existential questions of aging men. Outside the frost-covered window, snow began to fall gently, each flake drifting down like a whispered secret. The white powder slowly accumulated on the familiar path that led from the back door to the small examination room he had kept after retiring 3 years ago. Even though he was officially retired, Mr. Elliot couldn't give up the habit of helping the small animals that lived around the area. Dogs with torn paws, rabbits caught in wire fencing, and injured birds brought in by concerned neighbors were his only remaining connection to a world that seemed to be moving on without him. That sense of purpose was the only thing that kept the loneliness at bay in a house that often felt too large and too empty. A knock on the door suddenly echoed through the house, sharp and unexpected, cutting through the peaceful silence like a knife. Mr. Elliot set down his mug carefully, the coffee still too hot to drink, and stood up with the slow deliberation of a man whose joints protested every movement. He walked through the narrow hallway, past photographs of a younger version of himself with people who were no longer there, and opened the heavy wooden door. On the porch stood Mrs. Patterson, a neighbor from 2 houses down, holding a small bundle wrapped in a faded blue towel. Her face was flushed from the cold, her breath coming out in visible puffs. "I think it's a kitten," she said quickly, her words tumbling over each other. "It was lying by the forest edge, shaking so badly I thought it might die right there in the snow." Mr. Elliot took the bundle gently, feeling the weight of it, lighter than he expected. He invited her in, but she hurried back to her visiting grandchildren, leaving him alone with the shivering passenger. He carried the bundle into the warmth of the kitchen, where Maisie lifted her head with mild curiosity. His fingers worked slowly, peeling back the layers of a towel with the practiced care of a long career. A tiny body appeared, trembling uncontrollably, but when he saw the face, his hands froze. Those eyes, large, golden, and wild, stared back at him. This wasn't a kitten at all. It was a baby bobcat, no more than a few weeks old, skinny and weak, its spotted fur matted and dirty. Yet, despite its suffering, those eyes held an intelligence and an awareness that seemed far too knowing for such a young creature. And then it made a sound. Not a meow, not a cry, but something in between. "Me," it said, the sound choked and uncertain. Then, after a pause, "Re." The sounds were different from anything he had heard in 40 years of practice, strange and haunting, like words from a language he had never learned but somehow almost understood. "Come in, little one," he whispered, his voice instinctively dropping to the soothing tone he used with frightened animals. He carried the bobcat to the examination room, a space filled with the tools and supplies of a lifetime. He turned on the heat lamp, adjusting it, so the warm glow fell directly on the baby bobcat resting on a fresh towel. His hands moved automatically through the familiar routine, filling a bottle with warm milk formula and checking vital signs with methodical movements. The heartbeat was weak but steady, a fragile flutter beneath his fingertips. Severe dehydration and dangerously low body temperature told a story of a long struggle in the snow. But through it all, those golden eyes kept staring at him, unwavering, as if the creature were studying him just as carefully as he studied it. The intensity was unsettling, almost human in its focus. As he adjusted his stethoscope with shaking hands, Maisie walked into the room with her usual casual confidence. She approached the table slowly, her whiskers twitching at the unfamiliar scent. She let out a simple meow, a greeting, curious but not aggressive. The bobcat's head turned immediately. Without hesitation it responded, "Me." The sound was surprisingly loud and purposeful for such a small creature. Maisie tilted her head and meowed longer, more insistently. "Gree," the bobcat answered, the syllable drawn out and rolling, almost like a word being carefully pronounced. Mr. Elliot stopped and watched, fascinated. Back and forth they went, Maisie with her standard feline vocabulary and the bobcat with its strange, varied sounds that seemed to shift and change with each utterance. A laugh bubbled up from deep in Elliot's chest, a sound he hadn't made in months. It was a conversation no human could understand, a dialogue in languages that didn't match but connected perfectly. When he cleared his throat and said, "Hello, I'm Elliot," the bobcat responded with a strange, long sound that started low and climbed higher, like a question being asked. The syllables were distinct and purposeful. From that day forward, the house became noisier than it had been in years. Every morning at 6:30, the duet would begin. Maisie's insistent meows met by the bobcat's responding me-gree-ree. The creature, which Elliot now called Little One, only responded when he used a deep, slow voice, the voice he used to speak to frightened horses. The most extraordinary moments occurred when the weight of loneliness settled over Elliot. Whenever he sighed while lost in memories of his late wife, Martha, Little One would make a low, soft sound, almost like a lullaby. The timing was so perfect that Elliot would turn around, expecting to see a person standing there. These reactions weren't taught in any veterinary textbook. Little One simply felt as if it already knew how to comfort. As the winter deepened, the bond grew. Little One refused to eat unless Elliot sat near the bowl, behavior suggesting that mealtime was a social activity for the creature. And every night at exactly 10 p.m., the bobcat would move to the window facing the deep forest and perform a ritual of sounds. Me-ree-gree-me. It was a steady pattern, like a prayer or a call to someone who could no longer answer. Elliot began to realize that Little One was more than just a wild animal in need of rescue. It was a bridge to a world of connection he thought he had lost forever. The recovery of the creature Mr. Elliot had come to call Little One was not merely a physical mending of bones and fur. It was a slow, melodic awakening that transformed the quiet house into a sanctuary of strange and wonderful sounds. As the winter deepened, the small examination room, once a cold space of sterile surfaces, became the heart of the home, filled with the tools and supplies Elliot had accumulated over 40 years of practice. The rhythm of recovery and the social bond. The medical routine was methodical. Elliot monitored the heartbeat, which remained a fragile flutter beneath his fingertips, and addressed the severe dehydration that had sunken the creature's golden eyes. He kept the heat lamp adjusted, so its warm glow fell directly on the baby bobcat, providing the warmth the wild had denied it. Yet, as the animal's strength returned, its behavior began to defy every veterinary textbook Elliot had ever read. A peculiar social bond formed between the man, the domestic cat, and the wild predator. Little One refused to eat unless Mr. Elliot sat near it, pulling his chair close to the small bowl in the corner of the examination room. If he attempted to leave while the creature was eating, the bobcat would stop immediately, watching him with worried eyes until he returned. It was the clear behavior of a creature that had learned mealtime was a social activity, a time for companionship as much as nourishment. Maisie, who had initially maintained her dignity with icy indifference, eventually came to accept and even nurture the intruder. The two could often be found lying together on the rug in front of the fire, their bodies pressed together for warmth. Maisie took on the role of a teacher, demonstrating how to navigate the narrow spaces between furniture without knocking things over and showing the bobcat how to use the water dish without splashing. They even worked out a schedule for waking Mr. Elliot. Maisie handled Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, while Little One took Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, with Sundays being a joint effort. The language of the duet. The most striking development was what Elliot called the duet. Every morning around 6:30, Maisie would deliver her standard wake-up call of insistent meows. From wherever the bobcat had chosen to sleep, the answering sounds would come, me-gree-ree. These sounds were varied, sometimes short and clipped, sometimes long and melodic, but they were always responsive, a genuine dialogue in a language that connected the two different species. Elliot noticed that little one was particularly sensitive to the register of his own voice. The bobcat remained silent if he spoke in his normal tone, but if he used a deep, slow voice, the way he once spoke to frightened horses, the creature would answer immediately with its strange vocabulary. The creature's, humanity, revealed itself most poignantly through a ritual of reassurance. Whenever Elliot forgot to say his usual phrase before leaving the house, "I'll be back soon," little one would cry out urgently and pace frantically by the door. Only when it heard those specific verbal promises would the bobcat calm down. It was learned behavior. Someone had taught this creature that departures required reassurances and that absences were temporary. The harmonica and the ghost of Martha. The emotional bond deepened through music and storytelling. Elliot had a habit of telling stories to Maisie to fill the silence left by his late wife, Martha. When he told these stories now, little one participated in the emotional landscape. When he spoke of his first day as a vet and a calf he couldn't save, the bobcat made a mournful keening sound. When he described dancing with Martha under string lights at a county fair, the creature purred. Most hauntingly, the bobcat responded to Elliot's old harmonica. He would play simple melodies like Red River Valley, and the bobcat would vocalize along, matching the beats and pauses with its own sounds. Whenever he hummed, "You Are My Sunshine," Martha's favorite song, little one would answer with a specific unchanging sequence, me-gree-me-gree. These sounds became part of a shared memory, a connection that transcended species. The revelation of Coldpine Mountain. The mystery of little one's origins was finally unraveled during a chance encounter with Mr. Glenn, the mountain route mailman. As they stood in the cold, Glenn shared a story of an old man who had lived alone at the foot of Coldpine Mountain. The man was known to be gentle and lonely, and he had raised a baby bobcat, talking to it all day as if it were a person. Glenn recalled hearing the cat making strange sounds, me-ree, that weren't like a regular wildcat at all. The man had passed away that same winter after falling on the ice outside his house, and the bobcat had vanished shortly after. Elliot stood frozen as he realized the truth. Little one was a soul carrying forward the love and training of another lonely man who had needed companionship in the isolation of age. The man at Coldpine Mountain had taught the creature how to comfort with sound and participate in the rituals of a shared life. The call of the wild and the open door. As spring arrived in late April and the snow began to melt, the wild began to call. Little one was now nearly full-grown, a magnificent animal with thick, glossy fur and long, expressive tufted ears. While the habits remained, the bobcat's golden eyes turned more frequently toward the forest, following the movement of birds and shadows. Elliot, never wanting to cage something meant to run free, began leaving the back door slightly open every day as an invitation to freedom. He never forced the choice, but he made it clear the option was always there. One morning, the house was silent. The usual duet did not happen, and no answering sounds met Elliot's deep-voiced calls. He found the door slightly open and muddy paw prints leading out into the yard, disappearing into the tree line. Little one was gone, but the silence that returned to the house was different. It was peaceful rather than empty. Elliot kept the faded blue towel on the windowsill where the bobcat used to sit, a quiet monument to a friendship that had bridged the gap between the domestic and the wild. The months that followed little one's departure were a slow study in the architecture of memory. Summer passed in a blur of heat and green growth, followed by an autumn that painted the world in fire colors of gold, red, and orange. The leaves fell in heavy drifts, covering the path to the small examination room where a life had once been saved. Mr. Elliot continued his quiet rituals. He brewed his coffee in the old mug with the painted cat and sat at the kitchen table, watching the trilling. He still told stories every night to Maisie, speaking into the empty air as if the bobcat were still sitting there on the rug, listening with those attentive, golden eyes. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the suffocating silence of a lonely man. It was a place of waiting. The first return, a gift from the wild. One winter day in December, almost a full year after little one had first arrived as a trembling bundle, the silence was broken. Mr. Elliot was sitting at his table when Maisie suddenly jumped onto the windowsill. Her body went rigid, her ears pointing forward with intense focus. Then he heard it. Gree. The sound was familiar yet transformed, deeper, more resonant, and carries the weight of a creature that had survived the wild. Elliot moved to the window and saw him. Standing at the edge of the yard was a bobcat, large and confident, its coat gleaming in the winter sunlight. Those golden eyes were unmistakable. Little one had come back. The bobcat approached the window with deliberate steps, looking at Maisie through the glass. The two cats touched noses with only the cold barrier of the window between them. Little one made a greeting sound, soft and warm, the voice of a grown animal secure in its world. Elliot could only smile as his vision blurred with tears. His heart swelled with a joy, so intense it was almost painful. The creature had not only survived but had remembered the house that was once its refuge. But little one had not come empty-handed. In its mouth was a small pine branch, still green with fresh needles. The bobcat placed it carefully on the doorstep and stepped back, waiting for acknowledgement. When Elliot opened the door and picked up the branch, it smelled of the forest, of sap, and of wild places. "You still remember this as home," Elliot whispered. The bobcat responded with the clearest sequence of sounds Elliot had ever heard. Me, re, gree, me, re jeery me me. It was a melody, the very thing the creature had been trying to say all along. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, the bobcat turned and disappeared into the shadows of the trees. Elliot placed the branch on the mantel, where it would stay as a physical record of a connection that transcended species. The revelation of the hidden teacher. A few days later, while checking his mailbox, Elliot encountered Mr. Glenn, the old mailman. Their conversation turned to the animals seen in the area, and Glenn mentioned a man who had once lived at the foot of Coldpine Mountain. He raised a baby bobcat, Glenn recalled, talked to it all day like it was a person. That bobcat kept making strange sounds. Me-ree. Not like a regular wildcat at all. The news that the man had passed away years ago, alone after a fall on the ice, hit Elliot like a physical blow. He realized then what he had truly been given. Little one wasn't just a wild animal. It was a soul carrying forward the training and love of another lonely man. That unnamed teacher had taught the bobcat how to respond to human voices and how to comfort those in isolation. When the teacher died, the bobcat carried those lessons forward to find the next person who needed them, Mr. Elliot. That night, Elliot sat in his chair and hummed, "You Are My Sunshine." His voice cracked, but he pushed through the lyrics. Maisie turned her head toward the door, as if hearing a voice that still echoed just beyond human hearing. The long winter nights were no longer cold. Elliot understood now that he was part of a cycle of companionship that didn't end with death. The 75th year, a family of the forest. Years passed, marked by the accumulation of dried pine branches on the mantel. The visits were not predictable, but they were consistent. Every time he heard that familiar gree from the woods, Elliot would touch his heart and whisper, "I miss you too." On the day Mr. Elliot turned 75, he stood at his counter making morning coffee, reflecting on the many years he had lived. Suddenly, the familiar sound echoed from outside. His heart pounded with excitement as he stepped into the cold morning air. There, at the edge of the forest, stood little one, large, mature, and healthy. But this time, he was not alone. Beside him stood another bobcat, slightly smaller and more cautious. They stood together as partners, as equals. They walked toward the porch in synchronized movements and let out a simultaneous harmony of sounds, gree from little one and a responding call from the new companion. In a gesture that felt almost ceremonial, little one placed a new gift on the wooden boards, a small pine branch adorned with a deep red leaf. The leaf was perfectly preserved, chosen with unmistakable care. It was a birthday wish delivered in the only way the wild could manage. Elliot could not find words. He simply nodded, tears burning his eyes, and touched his hand to his heart. He felt the rapid beating beneath his fingers and hoped his gratitude was received across the divide of their species. The two bobcats turned away in perfect unison, flowing back into the shadows of the forest. The final understanding. Mr. Elliot watched them go, but he was not sad. He finally understood that love doesn't have to be kept beside you to be real. It doesn't require constant presence. Sometimes, love needs to be released to grow and spread in its own direction. The Bobcats had their own lives, but they remembered. He picked up the branch with the red leaf. A sign, a greeting, a way to remember. He believed with absolute certainty that whatever is spoken with love, even without words, is always heard. The form of the message or the language used did not matter. Only the genuine emotion behind it remained. The story of Mr. Elliot and the Bobcat did not end with a final goodbye. It continued to live in the wind, moving through the trees and in every falling leaf. Most importantly, it lived in the hearts of those who have felt deeply lonely and found that loneliness answered by a call from somewhere unexpected. It was proof that connection is possible between the most different kinds of beings, and that is where the story would live forever.